Hello and welcome to episode 2. I'm currently out in a field. The stubble's just been, all of the wheat has just been cut, and so you can stomp across loads of fields at the moment. It's just kind of magical. It feels like you've suddenly got all this open space available to walk. Episode 2 is just Andrew and me chatting about in-between strength, and it's a question that we get asked a lot as with new members or people on our courses, and they're kind of interested in knowing, like, what are the movements that we need to do as we get older, and in-between strength is just the kind of jigsaw, the glue that holds everything together. So we're going to go into some details about that. I realise that the podcast format without any videos is maybe not ideal for talking about very specific movements, but in-between strength is more of a concept. So we kind of dive into that, and I hope it's useful. But what I will do at the end in the show notes is put some more videos and reading about it, and you can kind of have a little sniff around and see what you think. Right, we'll get into it, and I will see you at the end.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
All right, so I can always start with so.
That's fine. You got to start somewhere.
You do have to start somewhere. All right, well, welcome back. Hi, Andrew.
Hey.
There is something. There's a concept called in-between strength that we talk about a lot, and a lot of people talk about it a lot. They use different terms for it, and we'll go into that in a minute. But I think it's an interesting one to spend a bit of time on, because often when people join our classes or on the course, it's kind of a new way of looking at movement for them. But we've discovered that also, sort of through your recent injury as well, we'll go into that, that the idea of in-between strength is just super useful for knitting everything together, and feels like a very practical element of all of this movement stuff that kind of keeps you going until you're much older.
Yeah. So this concept of in-between strength is, I guess it occurred to me a few times. I remember being really young and going to the gym and just seeing, big, strong, sort of powerlifting guys who are legitimately strong. Like, I'm not pretending they're not strong, but I'd see them get ready to do bench press, and they'd have people spotting on each side, and they'd get in this position, and they weren't using ply suits or anything like that, but they were training, and they kind of locked themselves in this position, sat on this bench, and then the spotters would help get the bar off the J hooks, so they'd unrack the bar, and then they would very specifically bring it down a certain range of motion, and they would bring it back up again at a certain angle, and then their buddies would help them re-rack it, and then that would be a rep. And I just remember even then thinking, it's like, that's interesting, because these guys are so strong, but they can't get that weight up by themselves, and they can't put it away. So it's like, it always seemed to me that, like, the whole point of strength is getting something where you want it to go and doing something useful with it. And obviously that strength will translate into other situations, never at that extreme application. So same thing if you watch powerlifters and they go to a meet, often they'll use a monolift, and often they will have multiply suits as well, so they'll have squat suits that will help them.
What's a ply suit?
So it is so a powerlifting suit, they have these special outfits that are super, super, super tight and super, super, super thick.
The Lycra.
Not Lycra.
Oh,
not Lycra. No. That's something you might see in Olympic weightlifting, which is a different kettle of fish. It is, well, it's a multiply suit. So it's like a suit. It's not Lycra. It is so tight that often you need 2 or 3 people to get you into it. And the way it works is essentially, imagine like a little imagine a little baby, a toddler, wearing so many layers of winter clothing that they can't move their arms or their legs.
Sure.
That's what these things do. And then they're so heavy that you can't even really sit down by yourself. But if you put a barbell on it, they act as almost like extra muscles where they add resistance on the way down and they help you on the way up. So it's almost wearing like a rubber band suit that's so stiff you can't actually move. But when you apply weight, it allows you to kind of slingshot the weight up. And not all powerlifters use these ply suits, but it's one of these things you just look at it. And again, it's like, it's this danger of when you chase one thing, when you chase sets, reps, numbers, whatever, and you decontextualize this idea of strength or capability or competence or whatever, you create these really over the top, sometimes I call it sportification. But if you have these really extreme incentives to do something, then the whole system will get warped to support those numbers. Anyway, so you have...
I'm going to put a link to what
Yeah,
it is in case you've lost it.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth just coming back. Sorry, there's a fly inside our recording booth.
Okay.
I'm hoping that gets picked up on the mic.
Sure.
I think so. You've got the strength guys doing their strength thing over here, having a lovely time, lifting incredibly heavy things a little bit.
Yeah.
Or walking with them also.
Mm-hmm.
God, you can tell that I don't come from strength. Strength guys over here, and women. And then over here you've got sort of the high intensity crew.
Yep.
They're lifting much lighter things and doing it really fast.
And sometimes heavy things.
And sometimes heavy, but generally it's happy puffy.
Yeah.
And what we miss in the middle, in the kind of grey area in between all of that, is the kind of in between strength, because you kind of end up going into your more extreme ends of whatever you end up doing. It's a very bad way of explaining it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess going back to what I was saying is the movement that comes before and the movement that comes after. If all you look at are these repetitions of these very prescribed movements, whether it's an overhead press, or whether it's a bench press or whatever, if you're just banging out these reps over and over and over again, but sort of ignoring how you get in and out of that position, then that's one of the real giveaways. That's what you see a lot in movement quality, where you see people who ostensibly are in very good shape, but actually they have trouble getting in, out, and under things. And that's what in between strength is. It's sort of where real life creeps in. It's when it's contextualized strength. It's when you get outside of the context of the gym and you're actually trying to do all these little things. So we think about all these examples like, if your kid's falling asleep in the middle of your bed and you need to quietly pick up your kid, pick them up, move them over to their bunk bed and put them in, you're going to be in all these positions that you would never actually find in the gym. You might be in this sort of half squat, half lunge kind of pigeon pose. You sort of do like a weird bend over deadlift kind of thing. And then you carry this semi wriggly object, and then the bunk bed will probably be a little bit too high for you to comfortably just put it in. So you have to get up on your tippy toes and maybe twist your back a little bit. Another good example is gardening, which I think is why we see that often gardeners tend to maintain these capabilities so late in life, because they're always kneeling in odd positions and they're always reaching to get things, and maybe they're picking up a heavy sack of potting soil that's not made to be picked up, So these weaknesses or these gaps occur when you do the same things over and over and over again. So if you're always deadlifting a standard Olympic barbell that's going to be 9 inches off the ground because the plates are 18 inches and it's always going to be 28 millimeters and it's perfectly balanced, that's great. And you are going to create a sort of raw strength, or like this kind of idea of strength. But then you will notice that when you try to apply the strength in different situations, it's not there because you're not on perfectly flat ground and everything isn't perfectly balanced. And that's what we're trying to focus on, is this real life contextualized strength.
And those movements, the in-between strength movements that you can practice at home or with your friends or wherever you are, I tend to be much slower because they don't scale up. So you can't kind of bash them out in a high intensity setting. They've got to be really kind of slow and kind of movement by movement, and really paying attention to the little wobbles that kind of come up when you do that. So a really good example, a classic example of that would be the Turkish get up. But there are a bunch of other movements that kind of come into this bracket. And I think after this, we'll put some links in this write up as well. So if you're interested in kind of really sort of watching and having a go at home at what we're kind of talking about, you can take some of those and have a go.
Yep. And then, one of the reasons that something like a Turkish get up is sort of a bad match for, say, any kind of high intensity metabolic conditioning or something, is because the incentives are set up to do those movements as quickly as possible. If the only quality you're looking at is speed and how much work you get done in a certain amount of time, um, then when you just focus on that one variable, you're ignoring all these other qualities. And with a lot of these movements, if you do them with momentum, if you rush through them, you're actually skipping past your weak points, and there's nothing wrong with doing a push press. There's nothing wrong with using momentum or moving weight quickly, but that's just one way of doing things. But if you do that, you're naturally going to skip by any of your sticking points. And whether that's because you have weak muscles or imbalances, or whether it's just, the leverage is bad in that specific position. And then all of a sudden, when you have to do something in that position, you realize you haven't developed strength. So when we first started doing Wild Strong, what we noticed is a lot of people who came from a background of doing lunges and things, whether in the gym or whatever, they'd get to that point where their rear knee and their rear shin was just about at parallel. And if they tried to go any lower than that, they'd just collapse because they'd never developed strength in that range of motion, because they'd always avoid putting their knee on the ground. And the problem with that is, if instead of trying to lunge down, if you're starting, let's say you've tied your shoe and you're trying to get back up again, if you don't have position, you'll see people try to rush through and they'll kind of stumble out of it instead of this nice, smooth, controlled motion. And that's just one example. You see it over and over and over again. If people have sort of artificially constrained their range of movement, to fulfill the requirements for some kind of sport, or, arbitrary points of performance, or if they kind of rush through it because of momentum or whatever, then they're not developing the kind of generalized, useful strength that will actually be important in real life when you're picking up a kid, or, doing grocery shopping, or when something unexpected happens. And that's the big thing, is in real life, if you're going to slip on some ice, or if all of a sudden, whatever, your car breaks down, or you have to scramble up some rocks, it's that in-between strength that's really going to help you get the job done.
Speaking of, I'm just going to shift my position because I was sitting in a really uncomfortable
Sure.
place.
I guess one of the things that you wanted to talk about, Jill, is just talking about gyms, and you're talking about the this loss of opportunity to move.
Well, I think something that in the early days, and actually still now, is when we started Wild Strong, something that we noticed, was people that came to us, most people came to us without a gym background, but those that did were very strong in these specific movements. And I think the gym, because of the way that we've set up more commercial gyms, and I'm talking particularly about sort of high street gyms that would have lots of equipment to do the things that we would normally do. Well, we've kind of managed to take out so many movement opportunities in our lives now and replace them with this idea of kind of going to a room with lots of specialist machines that allow us to run or sort of step up or whatever. What are the cross trainers? What are they called, where you do the sort of...
Yeah, they call them the cross trainers, or the ellipticals.
And they're all quite kind of niche movements within the context of your life and what you would do normally. And so it means that when you come to doing all these little things in life, they are actually quite tricky, even though you're very strong on paper.
Yeah.
And so when you come into a Wild Strong session or something, and we start working on in between strength, it can sometimes take people by surprise that actually they struggle really with these much slower movements that require a lot more attention to the little wobbly bits. And quite often that can be quite tricky, or quite often that could be, if it's the guys that are coming.
Yeah, the guys get frustrated.
They get really frustrated because they'll kind of look around the class, and most of we've got 80% women, I say, in our classes. Often, yeah. And those women will have taken a long time to kind of get strong in these in-between positions, and it can, I think, feel quite exposing for guys that join, because they realise that you can do a much slower movement with a much lighter weight, and it can still feel really wobbly if you haven't kind of practiced that little bit of in-between strength.
Yeah, one of the things about this concept of in-between strength is you sort of shore up your weakest links. Is a lot of times you focus on these little weaknesses that might be holding you back. And then if you're someone who's used to training in a way that specifically ignores those weaknesses, it can be quite humbling. I think of something that I think Katie Bowman was the first person to talk about it, but she's mentioned this before. The first person I've heard say it, that whenever you see like a gadget or any kind of convenience, it is replacing a movement opportunity. So you think like almost anything in the kitchen or all these different tools
I think about the long shoehorn.
Yeah, the long shoehorn is a good example. And I guess in a way it's almost a reverse affordance, which is probably a conversation for another day, that like
on affordances.
Yeah, negative affordance where I guess you can kind of get the example of the long shoehorn.
Well, the long shoehorn is currently hanging up on my dad's back door.
Mm-hmm.
He's quite a big fan of it because
Yeah.
it means he can pick up the long shoehorn and then he actually uses it to flick his shoe along the ground, and then he kind of walls.
This is a perfectly capable person. This is
is
someone who has no issue putting in a shoe if they wanted to.
This is a man who could put his shoes on, but has chosen not to. I like to see he's recently, since we moved in, has been like consciously trying to put his shoes on without the long shoehorn. But the long shoehorn is just a very good example because it completely prevents the movement that he would benefit from, which is A, balancing, and B, getting down to the ground to put shoes on, which would be even better for him given his hips. The other one that's a particular favourite, and we have one in my kitchen, in our kitchen, is the standy up brush, dustpan brush. The dustpan brush is a very long handle, which kind of negates the need to get down onto the ground and brush the floor. You can kind of sweep from a bent over position.
There is that sort of classic lazy bent over position that I find myself in a lot. What we're doing the other day, we were just picking up some rocks out of the new garden, and I was kind of lazy, and I was just kind of like half shuffling over and just picking them up, and I was thinking, gosh, if I could actually do a much better job, and if I would just get down a little bit lower, and then I could pick up the rocks. But instead I was just kind of ignoring that.
We've been running a series of litter picks along the coast.
Yes, litter
summer,
picking, that's a good example.
And that's been really interesting, actually, because we've had a really broad range of ages from like 18 months and up, really. And with the coast that we're on has occasional sandy beaches and a lot of rocky beaches, and the rocky beaches are the ones that people don't tend to play on. So and the rubbish just kind of builds up in all the nooks and crannies. And so we've been doing a series of coastal walks with trash-free trails, and it's been really good and deeply depressing in terms of like, this is a good thing to do, but also there is just a never-ending amount of plastic. But aside from that, the movement opportunities have been fantastic. But it's very good because it's really wobbly. You're on all these kind of different sizes of like stone, and you're trying to get into all the little nooks and crannies, and actually the kind of lazy bent over position you start off in, and then immediately realize that it's like actually really uncomfortable.
And you don't have the stability there.
You don't have the stability, and so you kind of have to get down, get in.
And it was great, and I'll admit that I was sore the next day or two after the trash-free trails pickup. Yeah, it's for such a simple thing, because you're balancing yourself over 2 or 3 rocks, and you find yourself sort of in these crawling and quadruped positions.
Particularly when you get to a bit that's very dense in seaweed and zip ties.
Yeah, a lot of zip ties.
A lot of zip
and
ties.
A lot of bits of plastic wedged under rocks, so there's a lot of shifting rocks around. Anyway, of
that goes back to basically my mum was right. It's that gardening, if you just keep gardening, you'll be fine. It gets you into so many weird positions. And like you have to move positions all the time, and you have to carry stuff in a kind of weird way, and all of the kind of rules go out the window in terms of like how to lift something properly, and you just have to move in a way that feels good for you, and you kind of problem solve as you go.
And pretty much just, whenever you think of, sometimes the convenient option, are you giving up an opportunity to move? I think that's worth thinking about. I guess the other thing I want to talk about is just this idea of the gym as a solution, whether or not it's a solution. So obviously, it's one thing we say all the time. We've lost, or we've chosen not to engage in these movement opportunities. A lot of times it's not a choice that we make. A lot of times it's about environmental design and where we go to work and how we get to work, and whether or not you have opportunities for active transport and things like that. So obviously we have this idea of a gym as a solution, and in a way it's the opposite of this in-between strength. It's this, the gym is what I find is often a way to build like decontextualized strength. So again, it's, looking strong on paper, or sort of breaking your body apart into these individual pieces and saying, okay, now it's time to work the biceps. Now it's time to work the triceps. And hopefully when I put it all back together again, it'll translate into capabilities or into this sort of practical strength. But I find it's often not. I find that often the gym is so decontextualized that the carryover is not nearly as good as you want. Even I remember when I used to run on treadmills, like to the point where I could run, pretty good pace on treadmill. And as soon as I actually hit the ground and tried to run properly on a trail or something like that, it was an entirely different kind of conditioning, because strength is context based. It's something that Pavel used to say a lot, is that strength is a skill. And a lot of the ecological approach, which we'll talk about in the future, is actually about building up meaningful movement skills in the context of whatever it is that you're trying to do.
Trail running is such a good example of that, though, because you're running, but you're also kind of, there's a lot of balance, there's a lot of like kind of understanding the environment around you and training your ankles particularly on all of those uneven surfaces and the feedback from the ground, and you're kind of constantly hopping between bits. I mean, it's such a great, I should do it more.
Yeah. And I mean, also your brain just gets going. It's we used to do a lot of that downhill trail running.
Yeah, it was really fun.
And we'd kind of go up this sort of mountain or hill, and then we would just try to run down and scramble, and there's a lot of shale and rocks and things like that. And it was almost like playing a video game in a way. You get in this flow state and you just run down, and you were so aware of all these different variables as you were going down.
It's such a different skill to road running, which is such a different skill to treadmill running.
Right.
So it gets you into like different headspaces.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. And we talk about cyclists sometimes, and we both enjoy cycling a lot. I'm not a cyclist. Like, I don't own like a Lycra cycle outfit, and I don't have a computer.
You can call yourself a cyclist,
but I do. I can bicycle.
Lycra.
Yeah, that is true. But I guess no one's ever like yelled cyclist at me as like a slur. I guess I've always just been like a guy in clothes on a bicycle.
Sure, they probably did when I lived in cities.
Yeah, actually, I probably got a bit of that. And it kind of gets me thinking, actually, also with the treadmill as well, and with the gym. It's this kind of aside. There's this idea called the variability over use hypothesis, which is just that a lot of injuries that we see in people are just caused by doing the same repetitive movement over and over and over again. And this could be true of doing the same stride on a treadmill or an elliptical, or always trying to use the exact same form on the squat. Because, even though the squat is a great movement, if all you do is a barbell back squat, let's say a low bar back squat, for a powerlifting competition, or a high bar for Olympic lifting, either or, if you have this idea that there's this like platonic ideal of what the perfect rep is, and you try to do it over and over and over again, you're not giving your body the sort of nourishing variability that it needs. So you'll see that you become very, very good at one thing, but as you change, maybe you change your stance to a wider stance, all of a sudden you don't feel stronger anymore. And we're obviously much better about this now than we were in the past. I mean, I think a lot of people are doing Cossack squats, and a lot of people are doing single leg, squat variations and things like that. But you still see it. And, cyclists are interesting, because cyclists, even though there's loads of skill in cycling, obviously, I'm not going to pretend it's not, but the base movement is very repetitive. So, cyclists, famously have very low bone density, which is one thing. But I remember when I used to cycle a lot in university, I had these big, huge quads, and, I could go up and down hills, and, I was really good. But then I remember trying to run at a track, and every single time I would try to sprint, I would just pull my quads, because my muscles were really only good for one thing. And it wasn't until I started doing other things that actually I could get to the point where, I could sprint again with confidence.
All comes back to gardening.
All comes back to gardening. Yeah.
How ironic. Should let my mum know.
Yeah. And I guess within that, it's, when we talk about this idea of in-between strength, and gardening, I think is a really good example. Like we said, we're not the first people to talk about this concept. So I know John Welborn talks about field strong, and you've heard probably people before talk about being farmer strong. Dan John talks about this concept of anaconda strength, or knitting everything together. But these are all different words for the same thing, which is just real life applicable, strength. You're doing multiple jobs, and sort of, I think it's Dan Edwards who made this distinction, rather than talking about functional strength, just talking about practical strength or practical movements. Essentially, can you do this? Yes or no? Do you have the competence and the capability to do something useful with this?
Actually, he's got a great article I'll link, and he talks about that moving away from the idea of functional fitness, which we've very familiar with, and I think CrossFit's done a good job of kind of putting that on the map, to a slightly more subtle idea of like practical fitness or practical strength, which is the kind of, it's less abstract, because functional fitness is still slightly abstract in that you often have a barbell and you're doing these quite prescriptive movements. And we touched on this last time. The reason that we have those prescriptive movements is because they come down from a sort of competition culture, and you've got to have a right and wrong, which kind of by necessity of having to have a right and wrong, you kind of iron out all the in-between bits, all the nice little grey areas. And I think Dan Edwards does a very good job of kind of articulating that and talking about this idea of practical strength or practical fitness, which is stuff that is directly applicable to everyday life. And we talk about that a lot with particularly working with older populations, because that's the stuff that they need. Like they don't need, I mean, they can if they want, they don't need to be lifting barbells and stuff.
No, and a lot of literature would support that. You're seeing a lot of work with older populations shifts over to what they call task-based training, which is just like, can you get off the toilet? If you're at a restaurant and you're kind of sitting there at the table, can you shuffle under?
Get out of the car.
Yeah, and I think it's something that Dan Edwards and also Rafe Kelly has talked about a lot. Rafe Kelly's kind of talked about gymnastics as being a good example of the sportification, because gymnastics, you have these people who develop these super high specialized amazing skills on the specific apparatus, so they go really, really deep in the sort of variability in what they can do with that apparatus, but it's still based around, whether it's rings or pommel horse or whatever, in contrasting that with parkour, where perhaps the movements they do aren't as deep. And sometimes, I mean, I think very impressive, but sometimes not as aesthetically impressive as what a high-level gymnast might do. But they don't have set apparatus. They will use stairs and bits of concrete and buildings and whatever's around them. So they sort of create a broader skill set. And, this idea of equipment, being a negative affordance, if all you use is a barbell and dumbbells, again, you're not going to be developing those capabilities
it's kind of
in other contexts.
Ecological dynamics, which we will touch on in just quickly.
Well, I guess in the context of this, maybe just talking about Bernstein's concept of dexterity. So Nikolai Bernstein, who's sort of the father of a lot of this thinking, he has a very specific definition of dexterity, which is kind of a form of having movement options, having multiple movement solutions to a problem. So if you're presented with a problem, whether it's pick up something heavy or score a goal or get from A to B, you're always going to have like maybe this one most obvious way of doing it. But within that, there's lots of different ways. You're never gonna run over the same field in the same context twice. When you're returning a serve in tennis, it's never going to be the exact same serve. You're always going to have these little micro differences in terms of surface, temperature, fatigue, spin, height, angle, things like that. So he talks about this idea of developing dexterity, which instead of just trying to do this one perfect form over and over and over again, you have all these different options. And he looked at it in the context of blacksmiths using their hammer to strike a piece of metal. And what they found is that the more skilled the blacksmith, the more variable route they would take, because they had all these nuanced sort of micro shifts in their movement. So he has this concept of repetition without repetition. And it's funny because a lot of that has been taken out of modern sports training, because they look at repetitions and this idea of this perfect repetition over and over and over again, which only makes sense in a sort of decontextualized sort of spreadsheet world, because as soon as you come to the real world, there is no perfect repetition. And I think that's where a lot of this gym, and as good as CrossFit is, it's still in the gym. It's what you've done is you've made a sport out of classic gym movements, and you have these ideas of points of performance, saying there is one perfect best way to do something. So it sort of eliminates this chance of this opportunity for maybe not virtuosity, but the example I always think of is the Fosbury flop in Olympics. Someone was presented with a movement problem. They realized that they had a better way of doing it, and they created this new way to solve the movement problem and completely revolutionize the event.
What's the Fosbury flop?
It is in the high jump. Instead of going over the bar sort of forward or in a split jump, he would come over backwards, almost like he was doing a suplex in wrestling or something.
That's called the Fosbury flop.
Yeah, and it was someone who did it, and at first it was considered aesthetically ugly and blah, 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 but it actually turned out to be a much better way. And actually, I think was it pole vaulting now? Now I'm second guessing myself. Anyway, it's a form of high jump. Um, but if you did that in a sort of functional fitness competition, you'd get no rep because they're saying this is the way you do it, rather than saying, how do I get the job done? How do I solve this movement problem? Which is much more aligned with real life because we're presented with hundreds and thousands of movement problems a day, and it's up to us to come up with a solution that makes sense based on that context.
Sorry, I just
Yeah.
thought you were going to keep going.
Oh no, I can't. I was just giving you breathing space.
Yeah.
So I guess again, because so much of this discussion is sort of based, is kind of embedded in gym talk and strength and conditioning. It's just been interesting to see how different people come close to this. And what I'm talking about is this idea of movement quality, going back to in between strength. This idea, you use the example of a Turkish get up. It's something you can't really rush through, because if you rush through, it changes the quality of the movement. And I was just thinking that Charles Poliquin, when he started writing programs, mid in his career, he came up with this idea of tempo training, which just seems really simple and simplistic, but it's actually just writing down how long does your eccentric, phase of the movement, how long does your concentric phase, how long are you pausing, how quickly are you accelerating when you're moving through the direction. It seems really silly, but it's just an example of when you just write things down and you don't take movement quality into account, and people are looking at reps, one person might be moving those reps as quickly as possible, using as much momentum as possible, whereas someone might be doing them as slow as possible. And, whenever I do kind of go back into a sort of weightlifting phase, it's amazing how all these things I used to do as quickly as possible because of a CrossFit or powerlifting sort of emphasis, now I try to do them slowly sometimes, or I try to maintain the same kind of tempo when I do things, and it's a completely different movement.
It's a different skill set as well. And
Yeah,
it
it's
can
a
be
different
very
skill set. Yep.
humbling when you take the pace out of it. If you're really trying to slow it down into little bits, you suddenly realise that you're rubbish at it.
Yep.
But that's where the reward comes in.
Yeah.
I think what we'll do to sum up, that was quite a good one.
Yeah,
quite a brief,
good chat. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it was brief. We'll have to check at the time, but yeah.
I think what I'll do is we'll put a bunch of links from what we were talking about
Some of the movements,
into the description, and a few of those articles as well.
Yeah.
So if people want to do more reading around it and kind of really understand what we're talking about, appreciate that we are in radio format, so you can't see any of our
it's not
movements.
super visually stimulating.
Audio format.
I guess you wanted to talk about the injury as well.
Oh yeah.
So I guess.
I might just pause for a sec.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I can edit it.
Okay.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is quickly, we'll just talk a little bit about your injury, because that's been quite interesting.
Yeah, so earlier this year, I think in March or February, I can't remember.
End of Jan, yeah.
Something like that. At the very beginning of this year, I was sort of dealing with what I just kind of thought was an inflamed sore elbow, because probably about 6 months earlier, I'd gotten back into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And one of my first nights back there was a new black belt teaching the class, and I ended up rolling with them. So I ended up sort of sparring with them. And I think they were a bit nervous, and they put me into what's called an arm bar, which causes your elbow to go into hyperextension. And I tapped very, very quickly. But I think they were a bit flighty, so they really cranked on it. And my whole arm just really, really hurt. And it was sort of unbearably painful for a few days, and then it went away. And I just assumed it was kind of inflammation. But in retrospect, that must have been, I think that was probably when the damage happened.
The beginning of
it. Because it was my left arm, and put my left arm into hyperextension. And I noticed that if I was doing a rope climb or anything, it really flared up. So I was giving it time. But what happened in retrospect is that some damage was done to my tendon. And, tendons, while strong, if they get damage past a certain threshold, they're just not going to heal. So I was kind of nursing it. I was kind of going easy, and I didn't really think much about it. I just kind of changed my training around just to take it into account. And then I was helping move a pig trailer, and it was kind of a muddy day, and we had 3 people on it, and obviously it was in a pig pen, so it was quite muddy, and it shifted. And it just so happened that my elbow was extended. So my left elbow, so my arm was completely extended, so it was straight 180 degrees more or less at the elbow, and my my forearms were supinated, so my palms were facing away from me. And this is sort of like the classic position, especially if your shoulders are shrugged, of rupturing a bicep. So I ended up with a lot of weight in my arm, and I felt this sensation, hurt, but it sort of felt like, I don't know, like an accordion retracting in my arm. I felt this like sensation in my bicep where it just went brrr, and I just felt something pull right up. And as soon as it happened, I'm like, oh, well, that's my bicep gone.
But
Sure. Anyway, so that's a whole other story.
whole story.
Yeah, but anyway, so I completely ruptured my distal bicep. So going from my forearm over my elbow.
Got it refastened.
Got it refastened in about a week or so, and began the kind of rehab. And they, while the NHS was great, they didn't give me much to do in terms of rehab. So I did a little Dr.
Also,
Google.
not a huge amount of research on.
There's some. There's not a huge amount of research with athletic populations. So there's not that I consider myself a high level athlete, but there's difference between rehabbing active people and inactive people. Anyway, so I started my rehab, and I was quite conservative, but I was sort of much more active than what I was given. And it's interesting because if you look at the tests, they'll say that, well, more or less people will get back to full capacity in about 6 months. But what they define as full capacity is essentially, can you open your elbow? Can you close your elbow? Can you pronate? Can you supinate? And I was able to do all that. And I realized I was actually like, when I was ready, I was able to get back to doing pull-ups and bicep curls and things like that. And by that standard, I had gotten back up to 100%, capacity on my operative arm. But what's really interesting is when I focus on that in-between strength, the kind of qualitative stuff, especially if there's any sort of thoracic rotation, so something that shows up a lot, if you're sort of twisting your body, and if you're doing any kind of supported stacked joint work, so for example, something that might show up in a Turkish get-up or a windmill or things like that, I noticed that I had a really noticeable tightness in my shoulders and my biceps. And it's really funny because I've noticed in different positions, I'm pretty strong, but in other positions, I'm still really, really, really weak. So I can do, oddly enough, I can do chin-ups. So I can do supinated palm-facing chin-ups, but I can't do pronated palm-away pull-ups. I can do one, but that's about it. And I can't do any sort of reverse bicep curl movement. Anyway, this is just a long way of saying, I'm starting to get all this stuff back because I am getting in, for example, the Turkish get-ups, and I am doing a lot of mobility work, and I am doing like crawling and twisting and movement and just sort of engaging with the environment around me. But I just sort of think that, like, if I weren't going back to this idea of in-between strength, I wouldn't be developing any of this stuff. I would still have these giant gaps that would just show up, and I'd probably be avoiding these positions.
And do you think if you were Andrew of 10 years ago, do you think you would have had such an awareness of in-between strength? I feel like as we're getting older, we, you and me, are more and more aware of in-between strength. I think particularly as I become sort of less interested in high intensity stuff and less interested in the more extreme end, I just want to be able to kind of do most things at an okay level.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Andrew Andrew at the age of 25, so maybe not 10 years, I'm 40 now, but maybe Andrew 25 would be interesting because I think I'd probably try to power through it. Yeah. And if I were doing CrossFit, again, going to this idea of using momentum and power, I could skip through because I'd be doing a lot more in the way I assume. I don't know how it would affect, like, probably kipping and eventually butterfly pull-ups if my body would let it.
Is that when you were really into CrossFit?
Maybe 25. I mean, I was still a coach, but up until I was about 30 something. No, we met when I was 30. So probably anyway. So the point is that I probably would have avoided a lot of things, and I probably would have powered through them. But it's really through the sort of qualitative work where I really look at getting these different positions that I feel. I mean, it would show up in certain things like handstands and things. I would definitely notice the difference in my stability.
There are some movements, that just won't let you do it if anything is not working as it should, and they're very good sort of diagnostics as well. Like a handstand is a great one because it's a great way to check in. We sort of pulled back from the handstands a few years ago because we went into this big kind of practical movement skills, and we were like, well, handstands are practical because you really need to spend very much time walking on your hands. But actually we've kind of brought them back in because as a kind of as a movement that requires absolutely everything to be working together in harmony, it's a really, really good one.
Yep, it just means that everything's where it needs to be.
Is everything working as it should?
I'll tell you this, to your question. If I were just doing something like powerlifting, and if I was just doing traditional big 3 gym training, I wouldn't notice it at all, because my bench feels fine.
Yeah,
my deadlift,
you can skip
through, and it's also, the way that you kind of work with the barbell.
I think what we'll do is we'll finish it up there, because we've been on for a while.
Yeah, we've been on for about 40 minutes, so that's pretty good. All right.
What I will do at the end of this is put links to some movements from our YouTube channel. I'll also put links to articles that we've been talking about, particularly Dan Edwards. I think there's some good Rafe Kelly stuff, and there's some stuff that you mentioned that I can't remember.
Yeah, there's a few articles. We can go ahead and put those in on the show notes.
Our notes. And if anyone's got any questions about in between strength, or you're looking at like where to start, do of course send us a message, and we will be back soon.
All right, talk later.
Daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
I hope that was really interesting, and I put a bunch of links in the show notes, and you can see some videos that we've made previously on in-between strength, and hopefully if you're already kind of working out, this will give you some kind of food for thought on how you could maybe slow things down and get into these odd positions. And if you're not, it maybe just gives you an idea of movements that you can kind of wiggle into your day that are a bit odd and get you into these kind of creative, slightly strange positions, which over time will knit everything together and make you much stronger and more resilient for whatever life has to throw at you. So next week, it's not just me and Andrew, it's me, Andrew, and Ginny Urich. Now, Ginny Urich, if you're not aware, she runs or started 1000 Hours Outside, which is this fantastic resource on connection to nature and getting kids outside. She kind of had this moment as a mum. I think she's got 3 or 4 kids actually, but when they were quite tiny wee, she was really struggling and looking for things that she could do that felt like she could spend a bit of time just kind of being a bit more herself and not going to kind of endless after school classes and things. So she got together with a friend and they just started going outside and kind of getting the kids into a green space at either the woods or the local park, and just kind of spending a really long time there and not kind of trying to actively entertain them. And as a result, she's now, this is years on, she's built all of these resources. She's got a brain much like Andrew's, and that she can read and retain information, which is like, to my mind, a superpower. So it was just a fascinating conversation, and I really hope you enjoy it. So tune in, that'll be coming out next week. And then after that, we've got a whole slew of interesting people who are working in the world of movement, community, nature connection, play, all sorts of interesting things. Anyway, we will see you next week. Have a lovely week, and we'll speak soon.